Welcome back to Worldie Unboxed for part two of our special two-part series with Chip Longenecker, founder of RompHim and Podium. In the previous episode, Chip shared his journey from co-founding RompHim, the revolutionary men's romper brand, to leading Podium, a stylish jewelry brand for men. He also discussed how his entrepreneurial experiences have shaped his investment philosophy. In this episode, Aaron and I take a deep dive into the insights Chip shared in part one. We explore how his advice and experiences relate to our own venture at Worldie. Stay connected with us and Worldie by joining our community at worldiebrand.com for exclusive updates and insights. And don't forget to subscribe to our Worldie YouTube channel for clips of our conversations with our guest. Speaking of which, let's jump into the conversation.
So on RompHim, that's a business that went pretty viral, right? They got, I keep forgetting the exact number, but I want to say like almost $400,000 in a week on Kickstarter. So do you think for us, we can go viral? Do you think that's something that we should even be thinking about? Or I guess, how do you think about that?
I guess let me get a better framing. Are you talking about viral in the context of a Kickstarter campaign?
Yeah. Or I guess Kickstarter, and then because they went viral with the Kickstarter, but then they were also going viral just on the internet, and like I think they were featured on like Jimmy Kimmel and maybe a few other talk shows, like websites. Just a lot of people were hearing about their brand and introduced to their brand through the Kickstarter, and they were like talking about them, things like that. So do you think that we can do something similar? Do you think it's even worth trying to do that? Or do you think that just, if it happens, it happens? It's kind of impossible to know what's going to go viral.
Yeah, I think I agree with the latter point that it's somewhat impossible to know what's going to go viral. It's almost like right place, right time. And for RompHim, their product, it was almost like a nature of the product. They kind of set themselves up to go viral, and not to say that we aren't doing the same thing by doing all our posts and how we like interact with our community, but I think they kind of set themselves up to go viral. I know that Chip was talking about going to I don't know why I can't think of the name of the Coachella. So I remember them talking about going to Coachella and wearing the RompHims, and people were just kind of like enamored by these guys, wearing this kind of, traditional, I guess girls would typically wear this, or I don't know, like it's not a garb that most guys were wearing. And so I think that type of presence really helped them out. And it's such a unique and like different product for the target group that they were going after, that it just started kind of picking up steam. For us, it would probably be different. I don't foresee us going to like an event like Coachella, but there are other, like, I guess, events that are more conducive to our target audience that could potentially lend itself to being a viral event or, a viral campaign. But I don't know if we can plan on that. I mean, I think we can continue to do what we do, and there's a potential there for it to go viral. But in terms of like planning it, counting on it, or anything like that, I don't know how we could possibly like be able to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it's nice to think about, right? Like, oh, if we went viral, if we raised $400,000 or $500,000, then we would do this, and then it would just be so much easier because we have all of this brand equity built up. Basically did it for free. But like you said, it's really hard to count on that. And also, I think like you were saying too, their product, I think, just lends itself to virality a little bit more. And I think it's actually, there's probably benefits and there's pros and cons of that. So having a product that's almost like a novelty and people want to buy once, then I think that lends itself a little bit more to going viral. But then once you fulfill that Kickstarter order, maybe there's not a lot of demand after that. And maybe it's something where it's like where it's a Coachella or these festivals or events, and that's really it. It's not something I'm wearing too much. So I don't have to buy, maybe I buy it like once a year or once every 2 years, whereas shoes are more of a necessity and you need them more often, but they might feel a bit less like a novelty item and a bit more kind of like boring to certain people. So you're not going to get those people who just see it and they're like, oh, this is kind of fun. It's kind of cool and wacky. Let me just buy this thing. It's more like people who are interested in buying it now and in the future would be our potential backers. So I think might be hard to go viral, but that could also be a good thing for us just because our product is not a novelty item.
Yeah, no, totally agree. I think for us to kind of like go viral in the space as a novelty item, you'd have to be like, that brand Mischief or Mischief or whatever it's called. And their big red boot and all the other kind of like, I guess shoes that they kind of do. You'd have to be like something like that. And like you said, it's like a one-time purchase. It's not something that you're kind of wearing all the time. And I think that was one of the reasons why Chip and the gang kind of had to immediately jump into something else, like create another product, create something else in their product line. He mentioned a RompHim that actually was, had a pants version of it, I guess. Still short sleeve, but it was a pants version. So like coming up with something, they had to like continue to like make their product somewhat novel, like somewhat interesting, whereas ours would be a little bit more long lasting, I believe.
Yep. And then just a related question, if we did end up raising, let's say 100,000 plus on Kickstarter, we said it's probably not because we're a novelty item, but what do you think we would have done right, or what would be the reasons that we were able to be that successful on Kickstarter?
I think our community building would have been successful. So everything that we would have done pre-launch would have been a success, or there would have been some version of success baked into that like pre-launch campaign. And that means like making sure that we built out the different channels, whether it be like Discord or even this podcast, our socials, those kind of things, kind of like creating that interest heading into the campaign, and then having a successful like day 1, day 2, and then kind of being able to kind of build upon that. So I think that is how we get to there. And that's been the message that we've gotten from a lot of people who've done these Kickstarter campaigns. They've said that like you've got to go and do like the grunt work leading up into the campaign. And then once you get to day 1, you want to make sure that you hit your goal. And then from there, people kind of like, it's almost like a domino effect or something like that. People kind of jump on board. So I think that's how we get to 100K.
I think that's right. And I think community, that's kind of like, okay, for people who already know about us, like why are they spending however much money on our campaign? And then for people who are coming in who've never heard of our brand before, they're not part of our community, then I think it's the branding and messaging. We really nailed that and kind of clearly communicated our vision, our mission, differentiation, and then we really nailed the product. So I think community, branding / messaging and product, if we get all 3 of those right, then the Kickstarter will do really well.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
And then one of the other things that I thought was kind of interesting was that the RompHim team, they raised, I want to say it was like $400,000. I think that's what Chip said, but I think he said also in a week, and then they decided to shut it down. So do you foresee any scenario where we decide to shut down our campaign because we feel like we can't fulfill all the orders? Or do you think it would make more sense to just take as many orders as we can and then fulfill them when we can?
So that's a really, really good question, simply because going into the campaign, without having spoken to Chip, I probably would have agreed that we could continue the campaign even if we were, if we were going viral and we were hitting like some huge numbers. simply because we could delay fulfillment. You know, we've talked to several people who've done like Kickstarter campaigns, and they say that as long as you're building expectation in like your fulfillment, like with the rewards for backers, then and you're communicating like at a very regular on a regular basis, then you tend to not lose backers, or you tend not to like get people disgruntled. So I was more or less leaning towards that if we went viral for whatever reason and we hit a large dollar amount from backers, then we could potentially have different waves of fulfillment. But I guess looking at like what Chip and the team at RompHim like kind of faced in terms of like the supply chain, the inability to potentially fulfill that type of order that comes out of like that type of a Kickstarter campaign, then perhaps we would need to really start thinking about it kind of now, and think about like, okay, how do we like make sure that we stagger these fulfillment orders in the event that we have like a largely successful campaign that is bigger than we anticipated. Like how do we stagger that? And I think there are several ways to kind of go about it. And we've talked a little bit about it, not specifically for this case, but we can kind of use that same strategy. And some of it is just like what I mentioned, just the communication piece with the backers, letting them know. And some of it is kind of maybe how we stage our Kickstarter campaign, letting the first 2,000 orders know that they're going to get fulfilled right away. And then so that kind of builds like that anticipation, like, oh yeah, I want to be a part of that first group, that first wave. And then everyone else kind of get a time frame after that, knowing like, okay, this is the time frame. We'll continue to communicate. The second order, if you're a part of that wave, will be whatever dates, time period or whatever. And then so on and so forth. I think that would probably be the way for us to do it. That way we wouldn't shut down prematurely. But at the same time, we build expectations when it comes to the anticipation of backers who are actually getting the product, because some of them are not going to be looking to get the product. They'll be more or less looking to get whatever rewards fall up under that tier.
Yeah, I agree with that, because for me, at least, it feels like if you turn away potential customers, you might not get them back. And it's really hard to acquire customers, and it's really hard to acquire customers cheaply. And if your Kickstarter is just kind of like going viral, then you're acquiring them maybe the cheapest you ever will. So I think we'd want to do everything we can to bring in as many new customers and get product in their hands. And also just based on the kind of order quantity that we're thinking about and the price point that we're thinking about, we'd have to raise probably like $150,000 to $200,000 on Kickstarter, which would be a lot. So it might be a somewhat unlikely scenario that we even kind of like sell out. But I think also we could probably talk to our factory and add another 500, 1,000 pairs, kind of like you were saying, and potentially that doesn't really delay things too much. And I do like this idea of the first 2,000, 3,000, whatever it is, people, you have a specific timeline that you can communicate to them. And then if there's orders that go beyond that and beyond our initial capacity, then we take those, but we communicate to people, okay, you're not going to receive these on the same timeline. It might be another month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever it is. So I think what you said definitely makes sense.
Yeah. I on the flip side of that, I was kind of like thinking as you were talking and thinking about like shutting down a campaign prematurely, is there a negative outcome? Because we just talked about positive outcomes, or like a good problem, shutting down the Kickstarter campaign. Is there a more traditional problem, a bad problem that would shut down the campaign?
Oh, so not
not positive.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. I'm sure there is. I was thinking like, because I thought what you're asking is, if you do what we were saying, like fulfill all those orders, are there any drawbacks of doing that? And I was thinking like delivery timelines, supply chain, stuff like that. But in terms of like bad reasons that the Kickstarter campaign we'd need to shut that down for, I mean, potentially it's we get the product because I'd hope that we would test the product before we run the Kickstarter campaign. But if we find out there's some issue with the product, then we would probably have to shut it down. If there's some kind of like supply chain issue where our factory just can't send it to us, or they can't send it to us for another like 10 months or something, then I could foresee us shutting it down too. But I think it's really supply chain that would be the reason why. Supply chain or some product issue would be the bad reasons that we'd need to shut it down.
Yeah. I wonder if there's any, like, if we were really undershooting goals and there's some type of like potential negativity associated with like not necessarily like failure, but like not being anywhere near where we want to be at. And hopefully this goes back to like goal setting and doing that very modestly. But I wonder if there's anything like, oh yeah, let's just go ahead and pull the plug on this one and really like take this as like the lessons learned and figure out like how we're going to kind of get back in front of the consumer in a new, fresh way that actually resonates. I don't know if there's a scenario like that, but I could see maybe a potential. But I don't know. Even in that situation, I don't know if it's worth shutting down a Kickstarter prematurely.
Yeah, that made me think of something. So I've seen some people who have shut down their campaign when it seems like they're about to get funded. And I know we have an internal kind of like stretch goal, which is above, like significantly above 10,000. But we've talked about doing the 10,000, the minimum Kickstarter goal, because if you hit that on the first day, then you get a lot of momentum. That's basically what we've heard. So if we were to run a campaign and we raise like, let's say 1,000 or 2,000 on the first day, and then we're slowly creeping up, and as we get towards the 30-day mark, looks like we might barely hit 10,000, but that's it. I could foresee us saying, you know what, we got a decent amount of people interested, but we can do much more if we make some changes. So let's shut this down and try to do it again, and maybe like 5 to 10x what we were raising.
Yeah. I guess that would maybe definitely lend itself to us just kind of let's situate ourselves up again and retry this thing. So yeah, no, I kind of agree with that.
So one of the things that differentiation is a topic that comes up over and over again with the consumer founders that we've talked to. And one of the things that Chip was saying about men's jewelry and why it's so hard is that you can't really see any differentiation when you're looking online, for example, just because it all looks the same. And I would think that even in person, unless you're an expert, it'd be pretty hard to differentiate between low quality and high quality jewelry. So do you think that with shoes, it's different in that if you just look at it, it's clear to tell whether it's two products, whether they're differentiated, quality, things like that? Or do you think it's more like jewelry where it all just kind of looks the same?
I mean, I think jewelry is mostly present for aesthetic reasons. Like there's no, I mean, I'm sure I don't want to be like I don't want to say an absolute here. Because there could be some jewelry out there that's set up for like a utility. Okay, for instance, a watch has a utility purpose. So there are some jewelry out there that has like utility purposes behind it. But for the most part, jewelry is, just there to kind of be seen. For shoes, they actually do have utility beyond just their aesthetic appeal. Like obviously there's got to be some type of like aesthetic appeal to the wearer or to, a group of individuals. But I think that you can kind of see the utility in shoes, especially like sports or athletic shoes, right away. For instance, like a cleat, you could tell that, okay, this shoe, while pleasing to the eye, also offers some type of like utility, and it's different than this basketball shoe or whatever. So there's like differentiation in terms of like product like use, but then kind of like, I guess going a little bit further into your question in terms of like being able to recognize quality, recognize I don't know if there was another aspect of it that you were saying that was like a differentiation piece, but like I think how you do that is you kind of like almost have to like hold it. You've got to like test it. You've got to look at it and see if this thing is like cheaply made from your novice eye, because obviously most people who handle the shoe aren't going to be designers or anything like that. But you can kind of like get a sense of the quality based upon like the feel of the material, the look a little bit. You can kind of tell whether or not, if you can see like the glue coming out and seeping through some of the edges, or the stitching kind of fraying. And this is like right out of the box, or just like visually being able to see it. Then you can kind of like say, yeah, this shoe doesn't look like it's well made. And a well-made shoe kind of doesn't have any of those features that I just mentioned. It's seamless. It has no indication of like the construction behind it wearing or tearing already. And I think maybe that's one way you kind of differentiate. You do it on the product line when it's being assembled. You make sure that as it's coming through, that anything that doesn't fit your criteria or your standard doesn't get shipped out to the consumer. And a consistently like, I guess quality shoe, then you can kind of use that aspect to differentiate, like, okay, the shoe never has any kind of flaws or blemishes. It's always, and not to say that we can kind of reach that standard right off, but like that's a way to kind of differentiate based off of quality. And then based off of like use, kind of like what I was alluding to earlier, having something, and this is why we wanted to bring up the lug pattern up to the midsole and maybe up a little to the upper of the shoe, because it kind of indicates that this particular shoe can be used for more than just a single purpose. And that is another piece that you can use to differentiate. And then also the aesthetics. We've talked about a number of different things that we want to do with our design, that the teams brought up, that we brought up, that kind of differentiates based upon like just the look, to look a little bit different than what's out there, what's mainstream. Still recognizable, but its aesthetic appeal is just a bit different. So I think those might be the ways that we kind of differ when it comes to shoes and jewelry, because jewelry, like a necklace is going to be a necklace. You're going to see, I don't know. I'm not a jewelry person, so I don't have like all the like, I can't like speak to all the things. I'm sure like, just like shoes, somebody who's a jeweler can kind of like recognize things and recognize quality and recognize like different like features that differentiate this ring from that ring, or this, bracelet from that bracelet. But I feel like it's a bit harder because there's not with the exception of like some jewelry, like watches, there's not like a utility or a practical aspect behind the jewelry.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. And I think for me, for some shoes, it's easy to tell quality. Like for soccer cleats, for example, I could, even if you took the brand off the cleat, if you gave me like 10 seconds with it, I could probably give you a pretty good estimate of the price, just because I know kind of what to look for, what quality feels like, what it looks like. But I think for a lot of different shoes, it might be hard for me to know what's quality and what's not, especially if I'm just looking online. And I think that kind of shows the importance of brand. So if you're not sure if something's quality or not, but you see a Nike swoosh on it, then you're like, oh, that's Nike, that's probably quality. Whereas if you see, for a lot of people, if they see like Skechers or K-Swiss logo on that same exact shoe, then they would kind of automatically think that it's lower quality, that it's cheaper, things like that. So I think it's important for us to make sure that the product is very high quality and durable, because then we start to get that association with our brand. And then people who don't even know the brand, they're like, oh, I've heard of that brand before. I've heard that they last a long time. So even though I don't quite see the difference between this shoe and other shoes, Like, let me trust what my friends say or what I heard on the internet and buy the shoe because it sounds like it's high quality. And then the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking is it probably just is another point that indicates that it's important to do an omni-channel approach, because if you can look at a shoe, if you can feel it, things like that, then you're going to be more confident in how it's differentiated and the quality versus if you're just looking at it online. So I think that's just another important reason why we might want to get into retail sooner rather than later.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I thought of something else. I say that I don't have like an eye for jewelry, but I actually used to sell jewelry back in college. I used to sell it out of out of Sam's Club. So no, I'm not like a jeweler by any stretch of the imagination, but I think about like the aspect of educating the consumer, and being able to do it in person is a little bit easier. So we'd have like guys come in and they wanted to buy, even at Sam's Club, they wanted to buy an engagement ring. And so one is educating them on the thought of buying a significant like piece of jewelry from Sam's Club, and letting them know that like, oh, it's just as high of a standard as anywhere else. And so we'd have to have like the IGI cards, which is like a gemologist, like, like indicating the type of jewelry that's being sold here. And then one of the other main tools that we'd have was like the 4Cs, like cut, clarity, carat weight, and color, and making sure that they understood like what was good color, what was like, everybody understands like a carat weight, like they kind of go in knowing that, but like clarity and cut, like making sure that people understood that and why this particular stone was priced the way that it was. And so I think in the same sense, like being in, that omni-channel approach, getting people in and understanding like how this lug pattern, how this tread pattern lends itself to being useful on multiple surfaces, why this upper reinforced the way it is, kind of like stitched and melded the way it is, helps with this particular sport and also helps with this other sport as well. So like, I think that kind of stuff really is helpful in educating the consumer, maybe at the time of purchase, understand the benefits of this product as opposed to other products. So no, what you said kind of just reminded me of that real quick. I've worn a lot of hats in the past, and I forgot that for a short period of time, I was also selling jewelry.
Yeah, sounds like you're a jewelry expert. You were saying that you don't really know too much, but know a lot more than I do.
No, that's the extent of it. So that's it. Like if you go any further, like I might know a few brands of like, watches and maybe a couple of like things about diamonds, but that's about it.
Yeah. So Chip was talking a little bit about community building, and there were really two communities that his romper, I don't want to say took off with, but that, two communities that really the brand really resonated with, which was kind of like bros and then the gay community. And they wanted to focus more on the gay community because they didn't want their brand to be associated with kind of like bro culture. So we've talked about moms or kind of like parent groups when we've talked about communities, but do you think there's any way to get a bit more granular than that and go to like a bit more of a specific community, or do you think a parent community is specific enough?
I mean, I think a parent community is specific enough because I don't think our product is as, not to say RompHims are like exclusive, but it feels like it's like cut for a very like small segment of people. You're not going to see everybody running around in them. Whereas our shoe, we think the masses within our age range can wear this shoe to play a variety of sports and doing it in a variety of different ways on a variety of different surfaces. So I think we're a bit broader in terms of like our reach, but if we wanted to get closer to that persona that we've defined, then perhaps we can go in a little bit deeper and really focus on one group so that they become like our first movers or our brand ambassadors. and that might be a way of going about it, because we've talked about that as a marketing strategy, as a grassroots strategy, really focusing on it. And we talked about it from like a regional perspective, not necessarily cutting anybody out of the group based on any other criteria other than where they're located, where they're living geographically, and that has to coincide with where we're at. So I think that's hard to say that we would want to like really like dive deep, unless, of course, we thought we wanted to do it from a momentum, from a traction standpoint. Or we wanted to, and that would mean like going after our specific persona that we've already defined.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we do have that persona work, so we know kind of at a high level, what does our target customer look like, or at least, our thoughts on that at the moment. So we can go, like you said, we can go after that person a bit more specifically. And then we've also talked about getting micro influencers or giving out the product to specific people who are kind of like movers and shakers. And we have someone who's creating a list. I can't remember how many people are going to be on the list, maybe like 15 to 20. Basically like mom influencers or parent influencers. So we can start to build those relationships, potentially give them free product, ask them to talk about it on their social media, things like that. And that's a way to just kind of organically tap into some of these different communities. And it's not necessarily like a mom or a parent community only, but it's someone who posts content for moms and parents and is followed primarily by moms and parents. So I think that's another way to do it as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. Kind of switching it up just a little bit. So Chip mentioned, and it wasn't necessarily their "we've made it" moment, but it was definitely significant enough to where he saw it as like a kind of like a milestone. And that was when Reebok started copying their design, or Reebok or whatever was speaking. I guess they were kind of like speaking negatively about it, but then maybe I'm getting this wrong, they eventually like started copying or whatever. And that was more or less maybe like a "we've made it" kind of moment, when a big brand really starts recognizing, this small up and coming startup. Do you foresee, or do you like not foresee, like what do you think would be a "we've made it" moment for us?
For me, I mean, there's multiple that I can think of. I mean, obviously, if big brands are starting to try to copy us, then that's a "we made it" moment to an extent. I think if we get a retail partnership with a big retailer that we really like, I think that's a "we made it" moment. And we just have to be careful about the terms, because we've heard about people who felt like they made it when they got into specific retailers, but then realized later down the road that the terms were pretty bad. And if they had waited a little bit longer, then they could have gotten a lot better terms, and maybe terms that allowed them to be in a lot of different retailers instead of just one. So I think a retail partnership that really works for us is another one. And then I think if we're profitable, if we're able to leave our jobs and run this thing full time, that's another "we made it" moment. You could talk about raising money as well, but I like the idea more of like, this thing is just super profitable. Don't have to raise money. We're able to quit our jobs. I don't want to take it too far, but take a little bit of a salary as well. That would really be like, man, this thing has taken off and we've really made it.
No, I think those are some definite like events that would lend itself to feeling like we've made it. I guess if I'm going to romanticize it a bit, I think of a "we've made it" moment as I or you or whatever member of like this founding team is out there in the wild, in the world in general, and we come across an individual wearing the shoe that we don't know, we've never seen, and it's just out there, like people are actually wearing the product. I think that's kind of like, oh wow, you know what, we're kind of making it. Or if we're like, part of this, or we get recognized nationally, that maybe another like kind of we've made it. But I think the points that you like mentioned are probably the ones that would signal that we've kind of made it the most. But the other ones are a bit more like, oh yeah, it's a storybook. Like, okay, to be recognized nationally, or to kind of see the product being worn by a consumer who we've had no interaction with personally.
I think that's a good one. Like if we're traveling with you, for example, if you're traveling with your family on vacation to somewhere you've never been before, and then you see some kids walking around in our shoes, then that would be a really good feeling. So I definitely agree with that one. And our story is kind of similar to Chip's in the sense that we both started the company in business school. And he was saying that, they were going through all these different classes and programs on campus, and they were kind of serious about the idea. They wanted to just basically do one production run and then go work in consulting. But then it just kind of took off, and they realized, maybe we can do this thing full time. So I get a lot of questions from people like, how'd you guys come up with this idea? When did you decide to basically pursue it seriously? So in your mind, like, what was kind of that moment where this went from something that we were just doing as part of a business school class or program to something that you wanted to do, full time, or basically, seriously, and then potentially do full time in the future?
I know when you originally presented the idea, and it was at an intramural football practice, I think we were, you said that, okay, this would be something that you would definitely want to pursue. This is something that you kind of want to pursue outside of the classroom. But as far as validating the idea, this like program, this class, and this program at Booth would be perfect to kind of talk to consumers, get like some feedback on the idea, and really refine it so that we can kind of pursue it in earnest. I kind of like believed at the beginning, like, as much as like I guess any individual who's just presented with an idea can believe in it being something more than what it is at the time. But I think during the course of the class, building the new venture, I think it started to solidify a bit more. And especially during that Polsky program, which was like based upon like talking to consumers, when we started to hear other groups talk about, maybe the value proposition that their particular venture was offering, or how their business was structured, and realizing that their business was uniquely different than ours, in that it was hard to get an idea of like several value props, but like our value props were pretty clear. I'm like, wow, this is easy to understand, very translatable. And I don't know, it seemed a bit more attainable than what they were talking about. And I was like, okay, this thing actually does have legs, because it's not going to be hard for our consumer to get it. Whereas and this is, maybe they can clear up their message a bit more and make it a bit more concise and clear. But I feel like they had a huge hurdle to overcome in terms of like educating their consumer just on the value prop alone. Whereas our value prop was pretty easy to get. And so we could really just start, refining the business in other ways. So it was probably somewhere in the midst of that particular class and that particular program that I really thought like, okay, this venture can go far.
Yeah, that makes sense. And for me, I think being in business school, and Chip talked about this a little bit in terms of, at a lot of business schools, there's a bias against basically like consumer products or products that are not these new technologies. So something like clothing, food and beverage, shoes, things like that. they're already to an extent out there. Like most things are already out there. So if you're trying to make a new company, it's doing a new twist on something that already exists. And I think in that business school environment, there's just like a huge bias against that. So for me, actually, like getting outside of that business school community is actually when I started to realize, hey, maybe this thing has some legs to it, because we would talk to, potential parents in our target segment, and the idea would really resonate with them. We talked to former competitive athletes. The idea would really resonate with them. And then for me, once we started talking to people in the footwear industry with like 20, 25 years of experience, and they really got what we were saying and said, hey, this is something that the footwear industry needs. That's when it really dawned on me that like, hey, this actually is something it's not just a good idea. It's actually something that could be a viable business. So I think going through the business school programs definitely helped for me, like, refine the business plan and things like that. But it actually like took away some of my confidence in the viability of the business. Whereas interacting with some of those people outside of the business school community, especially in the footwear industry, added a lot of confidence.
Yeah, no, for sure. Why do you think consumer products kind of take a backseat to like tech, especially like MBA programs?
I don't know why it is with MBA programs, but I think just in general, it's that, okay, if you tell me about some technology that I've never heard about before, or in some space that I don't really know too much about, I'm like, oh, that seems novel. I've never heard of this before. There's no direct comparison that I can make. So like, let me listen to everything that they're saying very, very clearly. Whereas with athletic shoes, for example, everyone knows Nike, right? So as soon as you say athletic shoes, they in their head, they're like, what about Nike? What about Nike? What about Nike? And then like every question you get is like, basically, what about Nike? And it's similar if you were saying, I'm going to make potato chips, be like, what about Lay's? What about Lay's? What about Lay's? Same with like soda, what about Coke? What about Pepsi? Whereas like cybersecurity, not a lot of us know too much about it. So we can't really say, well, what about cybersecurity company X? Whereas if you look into all these different industries, like they're all crowded, and to an extent, no idea is new. Really, like everyone has these ideas at some point. So it's really rare that you get a completely new, completely differentiated product. But I think just because so many people know about consumer brands, because they're basically like household names, you're always going to get people comparing you to those and saying, how are you going to be differentiated? Whereas in other industries, people just don't know the really big players and who's dominating the space. So they're not so obsessed with differentiation. I don't know why I mean, maybe in the business school community for us, it's the fact that UChicago kind of pushes a lot of startups into the new venture challenge, and then they try to take a piece of the companies that go through the new venture challenge. So if you just look at it statistically, technology companies are worth more. So they're probably going to want to push people. They have a financial interest in pushing people to technology. And then also, I guess, if you're just looking at the stats and you don't care about where people have a passion, it would be like, okay, your greatest chances of success financially are in the technology industry. So just focus on that. So I guess that's what it is. And just in general, tech feels kind of new and sexy, whereas consumer products isn't. So those would be some of the reasons I would list, but I'm not 100% sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I think all those reasons, and perhaps just the model itself. I used to watch this show called like Silicon Valley like all the time. Hilarious show. I think it was on like HBO. But anyway, like one of the episodes, the startup, which was not Robin Hood. It's whatever the name of the guy, Pied Piper. So Pied Piper, like they were actually moving towards profitability. And one of their biggest investors was like, no, we do not need to be profitable. Like profitability is bad. This is not the way to go. And it seems like to I guess a consumer product like founder, that seems very counterintuitive, but to a tech, that's actually like the model, because once you're profitable, then they can kind of, the valuation changes because they can base it off of like your current profits. They can base it off of like future. They can look at your current profits and like, track it in the future and make estimates off of that. And that can kind of limit you, and you can lose a lot of value just off of like your profitability aspect. Whereas, and so I feel like investors, even investors like you mentioned, like the New Venture Challenge, so that would be like the school, they can turn a profit without the company being profitable for some years. You think of like Uber and Amazon, a lot of other like tech companies who are not profitable for, many years, but their investors were getting rich as they were going through different rounds of funding. So like there's a way to like make money even though the company's not making money. And I think that weird like tech type of model lends itself to investment a bit more than, just a consumer product, because the consumer product has to kind of prove itself, and it has to go and make sure that it has a no kidding like consumer base who's willing to buy the product, and it has to show that the consumer base is buying the product, and do it at a very high level before, or relatively high level, before investors are even interested in it. And I think schools like Chicago and other big schools in the NBA, arena understand that. They understand that because they do a lot of investments themselves. And so it's not as attractive to them to kind of push a consumer product unless they see it as being a true unicorn. Otherwise, their return on investment is capped or very low. So pushing these tech products out there, they have a higher chance of making more. And it's I think that's one of the reasons why they kind of, I don't know if they push it more, or they just like reward tech ventures a bit more than consumer products.
Yeah, which that's a good segue into the next question, which is basically Chip was saying that he's interested in investing because of what you just said. There's a lot of this kind of like startup space and investing is based around tech, but there's not necessarily a great VC type of investment vehicle for consumer companies. So that's why he's thinking about almost this being sort of super angel for companies that are looking for seed and pre-seed money. And basically his investment thesis is he's looking for companies that have an amazing differentiated product, nimble supply chain, they're omni-channel, and they have some kind of organic stardust. So just at a high level, what did you think of that investment thesis and kind of the sort of the mission behind Chip's new sort of investment vehicle that he's looking to do?
I mean, I think that thesis has good bones. Like, I think that's kind of what we were using without ever having met Chip and heard his thesis. I think that's kind of like what we were structuring our company around. Like, that's how we were doing. We weren't saying it under the, using these exact words, but that's what we knew that we needed in order to be successful in this arena. So I think that resonates with us because it just, it's in line with, our beliefs when it comes to building a successful brand, a successful company in this consumer product space. So at a high level, I think he's hitting on the right points because it's the same points that we kind of came up with.
I think that makes sense. And then I guess there's two: nimble supply chain and organic stardust. I don't necessarily know the ways that we can make our supply chain nimble. That's probably something that we'd have to talk to like a supply chain expert about. But what do you think our organic stardust is?
So I will talk about the nimble supply chain. We talked about it like at the very early stages of the idea, and it was more of a localized approach. We wanted to make the brand feature local efforts in order to, in local efforts in the distribution process, local efforts in the product manufacturing process. Like, I think localized is drastically different than what any other athletic shoe manufacturer is doing right now. Everything gets done or outsourced to Asia or even South America, maybe Mexico for some brands, but for the most part, it's far away. We wanted it to be done here and very local. And I think that creates a bit more of a nimble supply chain, because we can interact a little bit more. We can understand, because we're very close to like the origins of the supply chain, whereas a lot of companies are a bit further. So I think there is a way to like create that nimble supply chain and do it from do it using a localized approach. As far as organic stardust, I think our organic stardust would be like our community. And we've talked about that as being something that was super important for us, also very early on, because we felt that we needed to have a strong backing, like whether it be like a regional backing, like, coming out of a particular city or area. We thought that would be largely important, especially as we try to like navigate the ebbs and flows of this venture. So I think like building that is our stardust. Like that's like something that we can always kind of fall back on. That's what we could use to bounce ideas off of. That's what we can kind of use to help push the message further. So I think that is, to me, like the organic stardust, the community.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too. The other thing I was going to say is content. So if we can build really good content around the business, basically make people feel like they're a part of this in terms of us getting this off the ground, building it, and then also thinking about UGC. So putting on some of these different events, which ties into the community piece. I think if we get those two things right, then that is a lot of organic stardust for us. And it almost kind of like personalizes the brand in a way where people are going to want to support us.
Yeah, no, that's definitely right. Kind of going back to that Kickstarter campaign, I meant to like ask this a bit earlier, but I know that this is one of the things that Chip talked about as being a potential shortcoming, is not capitalizing off of their Kickstarter success right away. And instead and maybe it was the idea going into it that this would be like a one and done type of a thing, and not something that would like continue on. But if we have, I guess, immediate success during the Kickstarter campaign, should we immediately capitalize?
Like capitalize in terms of getting money, right?
Yeah, that type of guy. Because he was
Yeah.
talking about they didn't bring any
Yeah.
investors. They did like a little small friends and family round following, but not anything like significant. I know we wanted to push the can down the road in terms of like having institutional investors, but if there was a successful campaign, like we go back to like that viral potential, if that were to occur, would it make sense to immediately capitalize?
I'm a bit torn on that question because I could totally see why it would make sense to capitalize and raise, like, let's say a couple $1,000,000. And we've talked to some people who have done that, where they've used the Kickstarter to raise like $1 million, a couple $1,000,000. And we've heard other people say that that's kind of an outdated playbook. And if you want to raise, you should just raise now. You shouldn't even bother with the Kickstarter. So I don't know. I go back and forth on it a little bit because I think if we raise money like that, there is a huge potential that they would want us to just leave our jobs, which I don't know if we'd necessarily be willing to do. And then the other thing is, if it goes viral, one of the benefits of it going viral is that we have some runway, like the cash gives us a little bit of runway. And then maybe we use that runway to get a little bit more runway. And if we run things right, and if we're profitable, and so like on a unit basis, if we're profitable, then that can really set us up to go a long time without needing to raise, and then really only raising when we really need it. We have a lot more leverage, probably have a lot more sales. So for me, at least right now, I would think I'd probably lean against raising right after the Kickstarter, unless it was just really good terms and it made a ton of sense for us personally, but I think that's easy to say when there's no money on the table. So I think that would be something that we'd have to just, I guess, discuss and think about more once it becomes a reality. But what do you think about that?
I think back to I guess the part of the conversation where we were talking about the difference between our product and RompHim, and how RompHim was more or less a novelty, like something that lends itself to being purchased maybe once every few years by a particular consumer. And you almost have to capture that moment right away. Like, you think of like any kind of like viral anything, it's very short-lived. Like, you've got to like really take advantage of it at the moment of like at its peak. Otherwise, you might just lose that window because people kind of move on to the next viral thing. If our product was to be successful out of the gate, I don't think it would be based on virality. I think it would be based upon people seeing value in it. Like, not that they don't see value in a RompHim, but they see value in terms of like the longer term benefit of purchasing this product or having this product in the consumer marketplace. And so I don't think there's a rush for us to kind of capitalize on that. I think we could stick to like our original plan of really like going back now that we've gotten the product out there in the consumer's hands or feet. We could get that feedback. We could continue to improve it. We can continue to like refine our business model. We can continue working on some of these other goals that we had that we could accomplish prior to bringing in any kind of like institutional investor. So I think our product being different in terms of its use, in terms of its lifespan, will kind of, it bodes well for us when it comes to not having to immediately try to capitalize, even if we had a very, an extremely successful Kickstarter campaign or crowdfunding campaign. I think there's other ways in which we could use it to help us reach goals that are attainable outside of institutional investment dollars.
That makes sense. And I think we've talked about this at a high level, but if we were to raise, let's say, and one of the conditions is you have to leave your jobs. Like, I'm not giving you this money unless you guys go full time on this. And I don't know if they would also say you can't take a salary, but I guess what would you think about ultimatums like that? Would you, I guess, like, from a personal perspective, like how would you think about, okay, you have a family, you have to provide for your family, and that's a lot of risk to take on. How would you think about some investor coming in and making an offer that seems valuable, but at the same time, they're making you take on a lot more personal risk?
So I think what we've heard from the get-go, even back into like the classrooms, is that as much as a founder needs an investor, investors also need good founders. And a lot of times that relationship is the most important part of, the investment, like their relationship with the founder's relationship with the investor. And so I think it's not all about the money. So it's not all about the investment dollars. It's about that relationship piece. And knowing that like most good investors are investing in the founder as much as they're investing in the idea or the venture. And if we find someone who is overlooking certain fundamental things that a founder needs in order to kind of like survive, then that potentially isn't an investor that we're interested in partnering with. Because if they're doing that at the onset, when things get a bit tougher, and they, unless we have like some kind of storybook like venture, they're going to get tougher. There are going to be some other things that this investor does. And so like if the relationship starts off in a very poor manner, like, not really understanding founders, and founder maybe not understanding the investor, because there seems to be some kind of disconnect there, if that's the type of like beginning an ultimatum that just kind of doesn't work. That means that they haven't like had any kind of conversations. They don't know about like what we're trying to do. And they're just kind of like throwing stuff like that out there. Then that's probably not a boat that we want to jump in. And I think we've kind of heard that it's important to say no to certain things, because if you get in bed with some of these investors, you might find yourself in a situation in which you can't you can't survive. Like, so, and if you can't survive, then the company doesn't survive. So I don't know, like that to me would be an, you know, almost an immediate turnoff, because we haven't had those conversations that kind of like discuss our personal lives and like what we're, you know, where we're at, or we've had those conversations and they just didn't listen. So I think that's just, either way, a bad way to start, and those are indications that, you know, things might not work out.
Yeah, which actually that's similar. It touches on something that Chip was talking about. He was basically saying that for consumer companies, like institutional capital at the seed and pre-seed stage doesn't make a ton of sense, because there's all these hoops that VCs make you jump through. There's different demands on board seats, on growth. They don't really like consumer, so the terms might be worse. And then he was saying angels are maybe better because they add value, they're connectors, they do less diligence, and they're willing to invest based on vision, not necessarily demonstrated traction. So do you think then we should, if, because we've talked a little bit about trying to push institutional capital down the road, do you think that maybe it would make sense to do it earlier if we went for angels or super angels? And I know we talked to Megan about her strategy too. So do you think kind of like augmenting bootstrapping with money from angels is potentially a better strategy than bootstrapping, or bootstrapping for as long as we can and then doing VC? So there's kind of like three different roads, I guess, there.
Yeah, and I think it almost, you can answer it with like, it depends. Like, it kind of depends on where we're at coming out of like a first, and not a round of like non-institutional funding, like a Kickstarter campaign or a friends and family round, like, and how the product is being is selling. Like that there's a lot of things that would have to, like, I guess, play into it to give you like a really, you know, accurate answer as to like which way I think we should go. Because I think it's all circumstantial. Like, it's going to be dependent on the situation and depending on where we are. But I think two of those three methods kind of resonate a little bit more with us, because it allows us to continue to build with a greater control. And so based upon like the values and beliefs that we have and the direction in which we believe that Worldie should go. The other, like bringing in like, I guess you didn't say like bringing in investors right away. So I don't know. Like, I think I keep backtracking, but I think it's all kind of dependent on the situation, and where we're at, what we like, what potential we see, and what angel or super angel, like what that dynamic looks like. So like, I think it really kind of all depends. I would lean towards, if we're as successful as we think we are with the, you know, the crowdfunding campaigns, or think we can be with the crowdfunding campaigns, I would kind of lean towards, and we have a relationship with an angel. I think that would probably be the ideal route for us. But yeah, all that other stuff is super hypothetical. So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, as Chip was kind of describing his thesis and kind of what he sees as being an issue or a gap in the investing market for consumer companies, it all really resonated with me. And I mean, partially it's based on the way he framed it. If we talked to like a consumer VC, then maybe we'd be like, oh yeah, consumer VC is definitely the way to go. But I think, like we were talking about before, there's not as many demands that an angel is going to have they're going to invest with you based on belief in you and the vision. And, hopefully they have all these different connections and they're really going to be willing to go to bat for you. Whereas VC might be a little bit more hands off in those regards. So I think if we could find the right angels, that would definitely be something that I'm interested in, because when people ask me about raising from VCs, I just always kind of think right now, I don't know what we would even do with 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, whatever it is. But I feel like if we got 200,000 or 500,000, it's a lot easier for me to see like how we could spend that. And I feel like we wouldn't be over raising. So I think the angel and super angel route is definitely something that I'm pretty interested in, and something that I'd want to look into further. But like you said, we need to gather more information, and it's a very hypothetical conversation at this point.
Yeah, I know. And I have to acknowledge that, like, stumbling on an answer, not knowing exactly which path to go. That's internally kind of how I feel about it. And I think about like the situation that you just posed in terms of like, if we were to get 1 million, 2 million, what would we do with it? I think we would end up finding ourselves in a very similar position that Allbirds did when they first started, and they got a lot of capital in the gate. We talked to one of their, I can't even think of the guy's name, but anyway, he was like doing a little bit of advising with the founders, and he was kind of advising them to really like focus and hone in on the product, and they kind of like decide to go like the marketing route. I think based upon like our conversations that we've kind of had, that we would there's a high potential that we would go like that marketing route as well. Like we would probably push a lot of those dollars towards marketing the product, based upon like being able to be very lean to this point when it comes to product development. So we would maybe put, we'd put in a significant amount towards it, but probably not as significant as the amount that we put towards, building out the brand from a marketing perspective. So, and that could potentially just balloon the company a bit, kind of like the individual was mentioning, like without having some kind of like core, without having a solid like foundation in the product, you kind of like are, building a straw house or whatever. So like, I think there's a potential for negativity if we were to get that type of dollar amount too early.
Yeah, that's kind of something that I've always said, that I think it makes sense to run a company without outside capital for some period of time, just so that you build up good habits. And if you get money right out of the gate, it's really hard to not waste it and to make sure you're putting it into the right things, which is a segue into something else that Chip was talking about. He said, if you raise a lot of money, don't hire. Basically, don't hire. Like for us, we could have 2 to 3 employees until we get to $10 million in revenue. And then from that point, you start thinking about getting serious about hiring. But until then, you rely on contractors, advisors, things like that. And that's actually similar to something that Jay was telling us, that in consumer, it's important to run lean for as long as you can. So what do you think about basically just the two of us, or the two of us plus one other person, until we get to $10 million in revenue? Do you think that's a realistic goal? Does that idea kind of stress you out? What do you think?
No, I don't think it stresses me out. I think that's somewhat in line with our thought process. And I've definitely heard that a lot from like this startup podcast, and people talking about like what founders should do and think about when it comes to hiring. And we even heard it in the classroom to hire very slow, and fire fast. But I think staying lean, and we've already kind of harped on it a bit, is extremely beneficial, because it gives you a chance to build a good perspective as to like where to budget, like where to put your dollars. And you can kind of do it from like a percentage standpoint, so you understand the ratios, and so as more dollars come in, like the ratio doesn't change, you still know where you just are just scaling, really. You're scaling proportionally. And I think that that's beneficial to kind of like develop that with a small amount. It's kind of, giving you a chance to practice before you play at a higher level. So I think that is a beneficial way of going about it. And I think that's pretty solid advice to keep the team relatively small until necessity dictates you expanding your employee pool. And that it also goes back to like culture. Like, it really gives you a chance to develop culture as well. So if you have like a core group of 3, maybe 4 people or even less, then you can kind of start understanding what kind of culture you want in place when more employees show up. And so you're really molding your culture when it's still very malleable, as opposed to when it solidifies and it's harder to like make changes at that point if you've already brought in such a broad team of employees, and they're different like perspectives on culture, and you haven't defined it very well, or you haven't been intentional about creating it. Then I think it becomes difficult. So like, beyond just like staying lean and learning those benefits, I think culture is another thing that can benefit from being small and really understanding what kind of culture you want in place before scaling in that regards. So I think there's a lot of benefits. So I lean towards what Chip said, what I've kind of heard.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it definitely makes sense to stay as lean as you can. I would want to add a third person at some point if we could, just because I think, with the two of us, we're able to achieve a lot. But I think if we were able to add a third person, especially if they had one of these skill sets that we don't have that we're looking for, then that would be super beneficial. But like, I don't think it makes sense to have 5 to 10 people. I think with 2 to 3 of us, and then adding some advisors who really provide us some leverage, I think that's enough to get us to 10 million. So I agree with that too. And then one of the things, basically Chip did Podium through a venture studio. So have you thought at all about, because I've had some people recommend like, hey, you guys should totally do a venture studio. Have you thought at all about that? If so, what are your thoughts on that whole model versus what we're doing now, or raising VC?
So like an incubator type situation.
Yeah, it's kind of, from what I've heard, it's basically like, you come in with an idea, or they have an idea, you get some kind of salary. You're working with other or around other people who are doing similar things. They have some kind of network of people who help you get the business off the ground. And then they take some significant portion of the company. And then once it's incubated, you kind of go off and try to raise capital and make it into a good investment for the studio.
Yeah. So I've been like listening to like the YC podcast, and they kind of run like a very similar like incubator type platform where they bring in founders who may or may not have ideas, and they obviously do exactly what you kind of just mentioned. I think it lends itself more to tech than consumer products. Not to say that it can't be done with consumer products, because I think the way Chip is trying to like, or the idea is that it would work with consumer products. I think it's just like a longer time. Like tech, it can be relatively short before like you can figure out like this idea will work, or like this idea will at least attract significant investment. With consumer products, I feel like unless it's some kind of like straight up unicorn or something crazy that like goes viral, that has longevity, I think it's the proving ground. It's going to take, it's much longer. There's a different path. There's a different arc. So I don't know. I like the way that we kind of go about it. And I don't necessarily think I know we've kind of like talked about doing like programs, and we've even applied to different programs, but beyond just the network building piece, I don't know whether or not there's a huge benefit for us, because we've been able to like do like that networking piece on our own without having to kind of give up much, unless we felt like we had some significant gaps that we didn't have a way of filling without having some type of like outside investor, even even someone like an angel come in and like fulfill for us. Then I think our path right now is good. Like we've got a really good plan, and I don't necessarily see that particular plan being so much better that it's deserving of equity. But I mean, I could be wrong because I'm on the outside looking in, so it could be
Yeah.
different insight.
I mean, I think it makes sense as a model. I think if we were to do it, it would have made sense a year or two ago. So I think for us, business school was almost like the incubator, because we were doing school, like a lot of schoolwork and classes and stuff like that, but we had a lot of time to devote to the business and get advice, make pivots, all that different stuff. Whereas if we had quit our jobs and then we're just doing that full time, I think there would be a lot more pressure to start making money sooner. So that's where kind of like the venture studio model could have made sense for us. But I think at this point we're a bit, like you said, far along enough where it doesn't necessarily make sense to have someone take a bunch of equity to give things that we already have to an extent. So it would be like the venture studio model is something that I would consider in the future if I had another idea. And I felt like I didn't want to take on as much risk as I would take on if I were basically just doing it on my own. But for this business, I don't think it necessarily makes sense for us because we're, like I said before, we're a bit too far along.
Yeah, I agree with that. And we've kind of been told that with these other like incubator programs out there, that our idea has gotten to a stage where it may not make sense for us and for the the VC or the investor to be a part of some type of program where you're kind of like ideating and still working through some very like fundamental parts of a venture. So like I think that makes a lot of sense.
And then last question on the investment piece. We've talked a lot about entrepreneurship, serial entrepreneurship, but we really haven't talked about investing. And that transition is kind of a common one. People who are either successful or unsuccessful entrepreneurs become investors down the road. Is that something that you're thinking about or that you're interested in, or not so much?
I mean, I definitely have thought about it. Even if I'm continuing to be an entrepreneur or continuing to found, I think that just gives me a chance to get more experience, to get more understanding of a particular industry. So maybe it's not necessarily like footwear specific, but at least like consumer products. I'll have like a bit of an experience coming out of this venture. And if I were to, be a serial entrepreneur, potentially with other ventures, using that experience to be an asset to a startup and to kind of invest in that startup, and having built out our networks of being able to tap into that network to help that startup grow. I think that's something that founders in general should be doing. Like that's like part of like the entrepreneurial spirit, is like you've, especially as we've talked to a lot of people and we've gotten a lot of help, we've gotten a lot of aid, being able to kind of pass that along. And obviously you're doing it in a way in which you can be compensated as well, but at the same time you're actually still kind of benefiting this other venture, this other group of founders. I think that's kind of important. It's important to just help the next generation of founders kind of go a bit further. So yeah, no, that's something that definitely resonates with me. It's something that I definitely have considered, and hopefully will be able to do down the road, to just kind of leverage my own experience to help others.
Yeah, I used to think that I wanted to be an institutional investor, so creating my own VC fund or something like that. But the more that I like try to become an entrepreneur, or like, try to build a startup myself, talk to other entrepreneurs, I realized how hard it is to succeed in the space. And I used to be like, oh, I could totally pick out the winners, but I think it's very hard to pick out who's going to win and who's going to lose when it comes to startups. So now I've thought a little bit more about like, how can I, instead of just giving money, how can I use my experience and my connections to help entrepreneurs down the road? So maybe that's investing in friends and family rounds, or being an angel investor, or being an advisor for a few different startups. So I think that's now kind of like what I'm a bit more interested in the long term, versus just raising a bunch of money and making bets on different companies and not necessarily being as hands-on.
Yeah, no, that's kind of how I foresee being able to do it from that perspective. So I think I'm right on board.
Then this is the last question I had, and maybe I should have asked it sooner because it's not really related to investing at all. But Chip was kind of saying, and I think he said this with Podium, that he wished he had gotten the product into the hands of cultural movers and shakers earlier. So he's talking about athletes, things like that. And we've talked a little bit about not necessarily like movers and shakers, but people who kind of like micro influencers. And we've talked a little bit about actually paying agencies to give our product out to the right people. So, we've talked a little bit about this, but at what point would you feel like that's just way too much of an expense and no longer really an investment that makes sense? Because, you're giving away the product, you're paying someone to give it away. So I guess, how should we think about that in terms of how much it makes sense to pay someone to give away our product, if that makes sense?
No, it does make sense. And I think back to like the conversation that we, just the part of the conversation that we were talking about being a part of some venture studio or incubator program. You kind of graduate out of that, or you've already proven that you've gotten the ability to build out a network and to fill those gaps that you might have. In the same way, not to say that you don't need a somebody like endorsing your product or whatever. Like even big brands like Nike obviously has a bunch of athletes on board, and they have a bunch of like celebrities or whatnot kind of pushing their product. So I'm not saying that you kind of don't do that, but from an equity standpoint, and I think that's maybe what the question's about, there is a point in which I think you kind of graduate that. Like if you've already taken the brand to a certain level, you have to look at the cost benefit of bringing in a celebrity or some kind of figurehead as an equity member to help, push the brand along. Unless we feel that they're going to have some kind of significant, I mean, like, no kidding, huge impact on the amount of people who are seeing or utilizing the product, then it may not make sense from an equity standpoint. I think it can always make sense from a contractual or paying them some type of like royalty. It could potentially make sense in that regards, but from an equity standpoint, I think it happens early on. Like it would have to happen early on, and you would have to like really use them in order to help like the product grow. Otherwise, I'm more or less fine with doing it organically.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, if we were to do any of those endorsements, I mean, we probably wouldn't do endorsements with athletes right out the gate, but if we did those down the road, if we work with influencers, micro influencers, it's almost like we have to think about it like a marketing expense, and we have to make sure that we're trying to track ROI. So maybe it's like giving out codes to different influencers so we can track, how many sales that they're bringing in, and just figuring out like, how do we make sure that any money that we're spent, like, how do we figure out how much return we're getting on the money that we're spending with these different influencers? And if we figure out that the ROI is basically zero, then we don't do that anymore. But if we figure out that it's high, then maybe we double down on it. So I think it's just about figuring out a way to track that stuff and understand whether it's benefiting the business or if it's just costing us money and not leading to any more sales. So, I mean, I agree with everything you said. And like I said, I think we just need to make sure that we're tracking all this stuff and changing course if we need to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Couple of questions that I still have. I'll just like use them as like rapid fire real quick. I know towards the end of the conversation that we had with Chip, Chip talked about, as part of his playbook, kind of like focusing on like one thing as opposed to like focusing on many things and not being very good at it, at any one thing. What one thing should we be focusing on, maybe from like a branding perspective, and getting really good at?
I'm going to say the same answer that I keep saying. I think it's content. I think just the more and more that the more I read about marketing and social media, the more I'm seeing that it's really hard to get like paid ads and performance marketing. It's really hard to get customers for a reasonable price, especially on like Meta. Really, Meta is the one that I've heard that it's really hard to just get people to click. And even if they click, it's hard to get them to buy. So it just ends up being really expensive trying to acquire customers through channels like that. So I think if we can get really good content and organically bring people to our social media pages, and then from there to our website, and then on our website, they really start to understand the brand. And then if we have people on social media as well, making content, with kids in the shoes and talking about how the shoes have made their lives easier, or how long they're lasting. I think that's just a really, that's essentially like a marketing, it's a marketing expense to an extent, because it does cost money to create content, but the ROI can be almost infinite. Whereas if you get really good at like paid ads or something, the ROI is going to be kind of capped, because at the end of the day, you're selling. Whereas if you get really good at getting eyeballs on your content, then that's just an easy way to get more people at the top of that funnel, and then also get more people kind of like emotionally attached to the brand. So I think for me, that's what I think would make sense. But what do you think?
No, I think that's right on par with what I was going to say. I was going to say like community building, getting really good at building a community. And, obviously your greatest tool is content, or one of your greatest tools is content. So that checks with me. Let's see. Oh yeah. Would you consider our product novel? So I know that Chip mentioned that like, rompers were relatively novel. Like there's like an idea of rompers for men. Let me make sure that part's in there. Like rompers for men is relatively novel. Like maybe back in the 1800s, jesters or clowns wore them, but like for dudes, like there weren't a lot of people wearing like rompers or jumpsuits. Is our product novel?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? Like, it's at the end of the day, it's a shoe, and like people are using, because when I describe the idea to certain people, they're like, "Oh, I totally understand that. I see that that's not a product on the market. So in that sense, it feels novel." And then there's other people that say, I already buy one shoe for everything, and it works kind of for all these different athletic activities. My kid can wear the shoe to school. So I don't really see how this is any different or solving a problem. So I think it's not necessarily novel in the sense that people already use a product in this way, but it's novel in the sense that it's designed specifically for multi-use, and that we hope it's going to work better than anything else on the market for those, multiple purposes.
Couldn't have said it any better. I think that's spot on. next question, second to last one. What are your concerns about our supply chain? I know we mentioned it earlier, but as it stands, like, what are your concerns about our supply chain or our fulfillment?
Yeah, so we've heard that there shouldn't be too many issues. And when we get the samples sent, it takes maybe like a couple weeks or a week, but they always show up. But my concerns are about tariffs, just geopolitical issues between the US and China. I think also it's just a long way. So if shipping rates go up, then I think that could get a lot more expensive. And just in general, I guess this is not necessarily supply chain, but you hear a lot about products being ripped off in China. Like, so if we finalize our shoe, release it, and then maybe we realize, oh, there's some company in China who has basically the exact same shoe and they're selling it for 50% of what we're selling it for. So those are some of my concerns. I think a lot of them could be resolved by moving production closer to the US, if not to the US itself, which is something that you mentioned earlier. So, I think that's still a goal that we have to try to work towards. And I think if we do that, then a lot of my concerns would be addressed.
Yeah, I think those are my exact concerns, like the lead times, not being able to really understand them because we don't have boots on the ground right now because it's so far away. So we kind of like have to deal with everything remotely. And we don't have a way in which we can kind of like dictate the terms as well as maybe other bigger companies can who have a presence overseas. So I think being able to move things more localized will be beneficial for us because we'll be able to actually be, get to the company, get to the factory, and perhaps establish like a relationship, better working relationship. But as it stands, it's kind of a gray area for us. We, a blind spot, not being able to understand these lead times, and then the holding calls. We don't foresee, like, we hope that like the product is just selling off the shelf, but I think there's going to be some period in which we're like actually holding on to these products and really baking that into the budget and understanding like, okay, where are we going to be housing these products, and like how expensive is that going to be to keep them, and for how long. So like I think there's a few things in the supply chain that really kind of like concern me, but hopefully we can start, as we develop this team out, like hopefully we can start kind of like working to address those issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a good point. I was just going to say a couple of things super quickly. I think there's a language barrier, obviously, and there's a bit of a black box between us and the factory. So, I would hope if we move it to an English-speaking country, it would be a bit easier to develop those relationships with the factory. And then, like you were saying before, it's so far that we can't just pop by every month or every 2 months or whatever it is. And it's kind of hard to know what we're getting ourselves into, what it looks like when our shoes are coming down the line, unless we're actually there. And, we are going to go there at least a couple of times, but I think I heard of this other company that went like 10 times to their factory before they released the product. So that's something that is a bit cost prohibitive for us to do because it's so expensive to get to China. But if our factory were in like California or something, or Boston, I think that would be something that would be a lot more palatable for us.
Agreed. 100% agreed. Last question. So it seems that we have been getting either directly or indirectly poked and prodded in this direction, and it's kind of been the elephant in the room. So should we get a van, or is it too taboo for a kid's product, founders of a kid's product, to get a van? Like, is that something that we should really be considering?
Why do you think it would be taboo?
I don't know, like a lot of things, there's a stereotype between like vans and kid. Yeah. And not to get, too far down into those weeds, but like, yeah, there's a bit of like it's frowned upon.
Yeah.
It's frowned upon in many instances. So like, but at the same time, like, That's a great way to like do pop-up events. Is to have some kind of like van with your, your logo or your messaging on it. So like similar to the Rumbulance, should we be getting like some kind of Worldie van?
I think it's tough because we've talked to a couple of people who have done it. We talked to Chip and then we talked to someone else who did it. And I think both of them were kind of saying that they're not sure if there was ROI on that investment. And we heard from someone else that you want to make sure that you don't hire contractors to drive the van. You want to be driving the van yourself or have employees driving the van because they're going to be able to speak to the product and its benefits. They're going to be passionate. They're going to be able to talk about the vision and the mission. And I think that stuff, like, consumers can see if you know that stuff. So if you just hire someone who is reading off a script, then consumers aren't going to be as interested in buying, versus if me and you are there and we're talking about, our journey, and we're able to answer questions like, how did you guys come up with this idea? Or why do you guys care about this space? I think it's going to resonate a lot more if you're there and you're like, okay, I have two daughters, they're in this target segment, and you tell a story about them getting into sports or something like that. Or if we tell a story about being in business school and receiving our first sample, and that's kind of like one of our highest moments and what made us want to continue on, stuff like that. So I think we would just have to find a way to either get ourselves in that van or someone we really trust in that van. And then at that point, it's like, is this the best use of our time? And I mean, maybe if we had bought the Rompulence for $2, then the financial piece would be a lot easier for us to stomach. But I think if we're spending like tens of thousands of dollars on it, then at that point it might be kind of tough to justify. But if we can do it in a way that's pretty cheap, and like maybe we rent a van for a month and then just the two of us are riding around the West Coast or whatever it is, then I think that could make a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, actually, from an acquisition standpoint, vans or these like commercial vehicles are not as expensive as you think they might be. So I had a buddy who owns this soccer team out in Connecticut, in like Hartford, Connecticut. And so while we were in training, because he was also in flight training with me, in Arkansas, he purchased this van for his team. It was like one of those like party vans almost. Like, I mean, it wasn't a party van, it was just like a short van, but it's kind of set up like a party van. And so like he drove it back to Connecticut after training was over. But like, yeah, it's and then I have another buddy out in Texas who like does like kind of like third-party delivery services for Amazon. And so he purchases a bunch of like old U-Hauls and old vans. So like I think there's a market to get them pretty cheap. It's just a matter of like kind of how you were saying, are we going to be in these vans? Is that the best use of time? And the ROI on them is a bit, I don't know, ambiguous. Yeah, and I think it makes for a good story. Like it kind of like, and user generated content, like that part's cool. You show up with like one of these vans wrapped in Worldie like logo or whatever. Like it's pretty cool, but the immediate, like any like tangible ROI, it's going to be hard to like, quantify.
Yeah, I think we'd have to tie it up with content, right? So like behind the scenes content where we're talking about, okay, this is day 5 of our van tour. This is what we're going to do today. Maybe showing us setting up different events, things like that, and getting that content out there. And then also the community building. So running our kiddie combine or kiddie Olympics, filming some of that, getting that up on social media, introducing parents to the brand, having kids have these fun experiences and having them associate that with the brand, and then maybe also allowing people to try on the shoes. I think if we do all of that stuff, then it starts to become something that's worth a lot more of it's worth our time a lot more. And the more that we talk about it or about all these different things, the more I'm thinking, man, maybe that next hire does need to be someone who really understands content, who's really good at content, who's really maybe like charismatic on screen and things like that. So I don't know, but I think that would just be something that would make our lives a lot easier if we had someone who's just like very good at that and is almost dedicated to that on a full-time basis.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. That would be like a very useful individual if we were to add them on the team. I think that's all I had. That's the end of my rapid fire questions.
Yeah, that's all I had too. It was a really interesting conversation, and there were like a million different things throughout that I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is interesting. Like when you brought up the focus on one thing question, I was like, yeah, that was something I was interested in, but I already had 15 questions, so I didn't want to add any more to the list.
No, I when I originally saw your list of questions, I was like, well, you know what? I'm not even going to add my questions, but I ended up kind of using a bunch of them anyway, because yeah, we can kind of use it in other ways as
Yeah,
opposed
for sure.
to kind of making it a part of the podcast. But no, I thought that was really interesting follow up to the Chip conversation. I thought Chip brought up a lot of different things. He had a lot of different experiences from a founder perspective, from going off to Bain and like doing kind of like consulting work, and then from like an investment standpoint and an investor focus on consumer products, which is really cool because you don't see a whole bunch, or we haven't run across a whole bunch of them. Whereas investors in like the tech space are a dime a dozen. So
yeah, it's really funny because I knew who Chip was before. Like I knew of him, and I think he knew of me because we worked in the same office together, and we basically started at the same time at Bain. And I remember thinking, I told him this, but I remember thinking like, oh my God, the RompHim founder is coming to Bain. Like, that's crazy. I thought about him as almost like a celebrity. And then I added him like 6 months ago on LinkedIn just because I was like, oh, I never added him. It seems like he's doing something pretty cool with Podium. And then he just messaged me out of the blue and he's like, we have a lot of mutual connections, seeing some of your posts. And I'm thinking about getting into investing. Like, let's have a conversation. So just kind of funny how some of these people come across our radar.
no, yeah, it's actually super cool. And the wider we cast this net, the more individuals, the more conversations like the one that we had with Chip will occur. So I thought it was good. Thought the follow up was pretty cool. Definitely get us thinking about certain things that are coming up pretty soon, relatively.
Yep.
So
Absolutely. Yep, for sure.
well, I don't know. I guess we can cut it off here until the next conversation. But no, lots of fun.
Yep, a lot of fun. All right, man. I'll talk to you later.
Sounds good, man.
Yep.
Later.
Bye.